Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets.
That's a good segue into talking about, Utah and airships and the article that you wrote for, was it the Utah Historical Society?
Yes,
okay.
Which they rejected because it was,
Really?
Oh, no. Well, they thought it was interesting. I think the email I got back is, this is one of the most interesting things, but, we couldn't possibly publish this. No, it was published by Olaf Phillips in Paranoia.
Okay.
Conspiracy Reader. Even though it really has nothing to do with paranoia, or technically with too much in the way with conspiracy, I wouldn't say.
Well,
but, that's where it's going to go.
A friend of mine, our kids are roughly the same age, and so we meet up at the park for farmers market on Saturdays, and I said, oh, yeah, I'm going to go and record this podcast with a former professor from the U of I, and told him what it was about. And, a sociologist, if it's not quantifiable, it's hard to understand, I think. And I was telling him, you wrote this article and it was all based in, factual newspaper articles from, from the period. I believe FBI reports were brought in, to report on this stuff. There's entire archives now housed at, so the U of I, or I'm sorry, the U of H, the University of Houston. They have the archives and the impossible, which largely are papers from like Valais. But, this stuff, if you're just reporting on what's documented, you're not making any kind of prediction or speculation or anything like that. It's just kind of reporting on history. And so, to me, that's what's interesting about this.
It happened.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that you can really determine. What exactly happened isn't necessarily clear. Yeah, the basis for the Lights in the Sky article is really an old Bureau of Investigation. We'll call it an FBI, but it wasn't the FBI then. An FBI file dating back to 1917, 1918. And, that runs to about 400 pages. Most of the stuff in those pages isn't really interesting because they're just kind of daily surveillance reports, which often say follow the person, and then the guy had lunch, this keeping track of their expenses, following someone around Salt Lake City and nothing's happening. But what you get is the exchange back and forth between the government officials involved. And that includes everyone from the Bureau of Investigation agent actually in Salt Lake City with his boss, A. Bruce Belaski, the early version of J. Edgar Hoover back in D.C. So there's the correspondence between them. And then there's a correspondence between the U.S. Attorney in Salt Lake City and another Bureau of Investigation agent and the Secret Service agent. All of these guys become involved. So you only get that side of it. You get the view of the investigators. And there are two different groups of investigators, which we'll get into. And one guy who actually thinks there's something to this, and the other one who thinks that it's all some sort of nefarious German plot, even though they can't figure out how that works either. So that's what it's based on. And then the references to people actually seeing weird things in the sky, well, that's in the newspapers. The Salt Lake City Telegram is the main place those are reported. Mm-hmm. And what do they say? Somebody in Moab went out at night and they saw this weird light flying around. Mm-hmm. And that occurs again and again and again. So people apparently, either lots of people all across the state were having the same hallucination one night after another, or they were kind of weird lights in the sky. Which no one ever explains. Okay, that aspect of this is never in any way explained in all of the investigation.
So if this was happening, 15, 20 years after the first rash, which I thought occurred throughout most of the United States, or at least the Western United States, right, with the 1896, 1897 airships, right? And you were saying this is
that's more West and Midwest.
okay.
And even in Texas and Louisiana, there's some of these things tend to sort of move around from one place to another.
So this is related, roughly. I mean,
well, it probably bears. If you go back to the 1897 case, what are described are these kind of Jules Verne like airships,
mm-hmm.
and they seem to have, they're a form of Zeppelin. They've got balloons, they've got engines. There's nothing terribly strange about that. I mean, there's nothing which is otherworldly about it, because in 1897 you already had the technology. I mean, there's nothing there that couldn't actually have been constructed. So you already understood the basic principles of buoyancy with balloons. You've got internal combustion engines, and it's just a matter of getting a craft up in the air and then having engines to push it around. No wonder that they seem to crash on a regular basis and burn. So that wouldn't be at all surprising that that's what happened. The other thing about them is that they very frequently land. I mean, it's very clear that they're being piloted by human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they claim to be from one place or another, but they'll come down and they'll ask people for food, and there's nothing, but they don't have big heads. Okay, none of that stuff. They look like perfectly ordinary people, and they'll give these kind of different stories about how they constructed it and are flying it around. And so what you've got there is something that's not beyond the technical realm of possibility, piloted by what appear to be ordinary humans, but no real idea as to who's doing this or why. And then also why it sort of starts and stops.
Well, I haven't read anything from Walter Bosley, but I know you're an acquaintance, and I've seen stuff, from Giorgiani. We talked about the other day because he did that long interview, and makes reference to, some of these pilots were claiming that they were connected to some or a company that was going to go public on the New York Stock Exchange, and somehow there were, it was a Prussian industrialists who were connected to this, and I think it was Galveston, Texas. They found or somebody in the was it the 70s? Del Shower, I believe.
Well, Delshow, yeah.
So I didn't know if
well, that's an even earlier iteration. That goes back to the Sonora Aero Club in the 1850s. Now, these are a bunch of guys supposedly in the Sierra Nevada during the California Gold Rush, most of them German immigrants, and they're all building what they call air Zephyrs, which, and Delshow later, illustrated all which again are balloons and propellers, which, you could still come up with in the 1850s. And Delshow adds this other thing to it, that the buoyancy element in this was a thing he calls the zupa, the soup. And it was some sort of like, it's like this magic green liquid that they stir up. And this is somehow what powers them. It's also apparently is what makes them blow up on a regular basis. So, the Delshow thing, if it wasn't, Delshow was an elderly, eccentric folk artist who drew these elaborate, very sort of pretty pictures, balloon things. But if you didn't have those, there would be no discussion of any of this. I mean, there's no other record of it of any other kind. You can find that a couple of the people that he talks about as being members of the Sonora Aero Club seem to have actually existed. Although I think one guy that he claims died in a crash actually, lived on for years and years after that. So the names seem to have some kind of basis to reality, but that's in the 1850s. And, interesting, and that's where NIMSA comes in. This is the other thing this is one of the things that Walter is very interested in, is the NYMZA. What's NIMSA, which is this organization behind it. and he thinks it's a German. He also thinks that it's essentially German, which it could be.
Hmm.
The Germans do pioneer, the Zeppelin works that come along later. I mean, certainly they weren't the only ones who came up with airships. And yeah, I think it's worth noting that, particularly from the 1897 airships, within a decade of that, you've actually got those things.
Hmm.
You've now actually sort of maybe some sort of improved version of it. But it was who's doing this early on? I don't know, or why.
Well, the thing that's always, and maybe I don't understand enough about it, about the history of airships or zeppelins, but why is this taking place in the United States rather than if it's connected? Because it's always seemed this way. At least it's been tied up in my mind that it's somehow a German enterprise, and not to say that pre World War One that couldn't be the case, but I would assume that after World War One, you wouldn't be having this kind of situation where there's some kind of German offshoot kind of company taking place or building these things in the United States. So when you get to 1917 with your article, it just I don't know, it just seems a little amiss, but maybe I'm conflating two different.
Well, when you get to the 1917 case, you're not nobody's talking about big Jules Verne airships.
Mm.
They now appear to be relatively small things. It gets closer to the concept of the sort of saucer, although nobody ever uses the word saucer. But the problem is that nobody actually sees one of them. There's just these kind of descriptions, and the closest you get to it is that Van Valkenburg, who's either the guy who's making all this up or whatever else is going on, or is channeling it, whatever is happening. They eventually say they've got 4 different craft that they've built, and that everything from a kind of one-man craft, which is about the size of a barrel, that one person can fit inside. And they call that the tub, to one that can accommodate up to 7 people, the larger one.
Okay.
But none of the investigators ever set eyes on any of these craft. But there's nothing ever physical that ever materializes about it.
These are just lights sorry. There's
Well,
lights.
you got people seeing lights in the sky, and then you got these guys, Van Valkenburg and his friends, who claim that they have built these craft and are operating them with the help of the Adept, who's this sort of alien in a spacecraft.
Okay.
The mothership. All right. This
Maybe walk that part back.
okay. Van Valkenburg and his buddies claim that they get the technology from a being which they usually call the Adept, but they also call him the Old Man or the Superior One or the Supreme Being.
Mm-hmm.
They have all these different sort of grandiose titles, but who also has an earthly name of Nels Olson. Okay. So, according to one of them. So the Adept, let's just call them that. The Adept lives in a larger version of these crafts, a kind of mothership, we call it, which is in a stabilized orbit directly above Utah, apparently.
Okay.
Because they can get into their little ones that they built, and they'll just go immediately up through 7 strata of atmosphere until eventually they reach a point where the air is exactly like it is on the surface of the Earth.
Mm.
I don't know what that means. Which so here again, you get into this thing of trying to make sense out of something that doesn't, on the surface of it, make much sense. So we're ascending through 7 different strata of atmosphere, and then we reach this place where the air is perfectly calm and you can just breathe normally like you would elsewhere. And that's where the Adept lives in his big craft, watching over everything. But there's only one guy who actually claims to have ever been there, as far as I can see. And even that becomes unclear because Valkenburg, let's just call it, will also say that most of the messages he gets from the adept are telepathic, that the adept can just speak to him. The channeling thing, which becomes a element later on in the whole UFO thing. And that the motive device for these crafts, the technology that they were given by the adept has to do with these rotating discs. And the rotating discs are somehow contained within a device which is about the size of a man's fist. You can hold this in your hand, and there are rotating discs in it, and that's what provides the power. But there's no engine and there's no fuel. It just draws the power out of the air, or in some way. But that the device itself, they can't control the device. They can't turn it on or off. It's only the adept that can do that. So
I know in the article you make mention of Freemasonry and Mormonism. I recently came across some stuff that was kind of recounting a little bit, Mormon history in the late 19th, early 20th century, and how it changed from more of a kind of dispersed, there's elders within the church who are, you kind of engaged in more of a philosophical discussion or theological discussion maybe about, doctrine, and it's always kind of this living thing. And then, Mormonism as a religion almost kind of goes away throughout the United States until you get kind of the bringing in of the prophet. And so this central figure, and I forget exactly when that happened. I want to say it was in the 40s or 50s, and I could be wrong there. But how much of this is related to, kind of just the place where it arises, Utah, and the kind of the cultural milieu that's, of Salt Lake City? Does that have any factor, or was that just kind of this group of guys who were?
Well, I mean, Utah was even more Mormon in 1917 than it is today.
I would imagine.
So, and that's one of the interesting things is that a lot of the federal officials over there don't seem to be Mormon. So Leon Bone, who's the sort of lead investigator, I don't think he's a Mormon, which may be part of the issue with that. So most of the population is the guys who are involved, Van Valkenburg and the others are mostly LDS members. So Van Valkenburg certainly is, but it's not clear whether he's on good terms with the church leadership. He makes these references to, well, at one point he tells somebody that he is the head of the Mormon Secret Service. Okay, the Mormon Church apparently has its own, intelligence agency. Why not?
To do what? I was going to say to do what exactly?
And he's the head of it. Yeah, to do what? Why would the Mormon Church have a secret service? Or he's a special agent for, I think that the head of the church, the prophet at that time is Joseph Smith II or Joseph Smith III,
okay.
A descendant from the original one. And that there's a whole angle to this that the federal investigators looking at it, or certainly the guy who takes over the investigation, Whitson, who's brought in from LA and is not a Mormon, he calls it the whole silly religious phase, which he wants nothing to do with. And this is what these guys will keep telling him that, well, this has, that there are Mormons, the Mormon church is very interested in this device. And they've tried to buy it from us, but we don't want to give it to them. We're all being followed by Mormon agents who are trying to figure out where this is. What that seems to be connected to is it goes back that, let's see, how can I insult an entire religion? Well, why not? All right. Among other things, it's also a kind of saucer cult, just like Scientology. And it involves extraterrestrials, because the Holy Father lives on this planet called Kolo.
That's why I asked.
There's a whole hymn about, we're going to go to Kolo or something. So The Heavenly Father is an alien. Let's put it this way.
Right.
He is an alien. He is a physical being, an alien who lives on a planet. And if you're a good Mormon male and you have a sufficient number of wives and so on, and you follow all the rules, what do you get when you die? You get to become your own lord of your own planet.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know. This is completely extraterrestrial because there's an extraterrestrial force which is at the head of the whole church. That's the God is an alien, and then you get to be your own alien God.
Which so that's the reason why I asked this question. So I remember specifically as a youth in Methodist, Sunday school, we had a teacher who said, we can study other religions just for kind of juxtapose what we believe versus others. And so we all picked Mormonism, of course. And the only thing available was classified as anti-Mormon propaganda from the Baptist Church. And it was a documentary, and you can find it online. It's just a kind of a cartoon. But, I mean, souls flying to another planet where you become the head of your own spirit family and things of that nature. And to me, ahead of its time. In some ways, but there's very much, kind of a similarity in modern, you say Scientology, but other kind of cults and religions that aggrandize maybe some kind of the Billy Meyer stuff is very interesting in that regard. Like there's something that's coming from another planet that's very interested in me, in bringing me specific knowledge, and that doesn't strike me as extremely different from a lot of even the Abrahamic religions.
There's always stuff ascending in and out of heaven. Okay,
yeah, right.
Christ doesn't fall into the bowels of the earth. No, he ascends. Mm-hmm. Virgin Mary ascends. Everything's going up and down. So are they being beamed up? But there's always some connection to the sky, which is involved. So what I think, to back engineer their comments as much as possible, the Mormon church may have been, given that Van Valkenburg and others were Mormons, they may have tried, and I think maybe they're running some sort of con. Maybe they are trying to get money out of this. That they go to the church and they can interest the prophet and others in this because, we're talking about this higher being, which has apparently come from somewhere else. And within the church's doctrine, God is a physical being that lives on another planet. He sends angels and emissaries, and if there's some magic guy and some mothership floating over Utah, what if this is the message from Kolo? I mean, what if this stuff we've been saying is actually true? What if this? So they might be, because if that could be substantiated, it would, of course, prove everything they had been saying was true. Which I tend to suspect that one of the things that runs through this is that, yes, they believe this. Well, the church fathers promote something, which in many cases, they're not absolutely certain of themselves.
Which is,
and I don't know whether with a Roman Catholic or elsewhere, that you could be a theologian that would seriously study the roots of your religion and not in some way develop doubts about the accuracy of the information you have, because it's all fairly tenuous. You're not quite certain exactly what's going on. So anything that you could find. And this is, for instance, why the Mormons are very fixated upon any kind of historical documents and they will get them and hoard them. If you look into the whole sort of Mormon murders case back in the 1980s, where this guy was selling sort of, he was coming up with faked Mormon documents that in many ways were undermining the general narrative. But of course, what the church fathers wanted to do was to get a hold of every single one of those and to study them, but also hide them away. But they didn't want to destroy them. They were very interested in sort of having them. It's the same argument that the Vatican archives contain all sorts of information that fundamentally disprove everything that the Catholic Church says publicly, but which is very important to have nonetheless.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought of was the Vatican and the archives, which, in that regard, even if you have documentation to refute what you espouse to believe, it seems like it would be one of those things that you would at least be interested in and also want to keep under wraps. So there's two.
It comes back to this whole thing about that the test for anything in history is whether you have some kind of documentation for it. Is there some sort of piece of paper somewhere where it actually says that? And if it is, well, but here's the whole point. Just because there's something on a piece of paper doesn't mean that any of it's true.
Right.
Okay? The whole thing can just be a complete lie and utter fantasy. Look, J.R.R. Tolkien spent a lot of time creating an entire world which isn't real.
Yeah.
But it's there in such a substantial detail. And I think stripped of the context of knowing that it's fiction, I don't know. Let's suppose that the civilization is destroyed and aliens show up and the only kind of surviving book they have is The Lord of the Rings. Well, why wouldn't that they assume that that's pretty much the case? Because it kind of fits things. Why wouldn't that be the case?
Well, and that's, I don't know anybody who engages with history long enough and tries to kind of get beyond just your typical surface level reading of it, and maybe gets into the philosophy of history and time. It starts to kind of mess with your head a little bit. Nothing is, you've said it a few times to me, and I completely agree. But we're telling stories. We're telling stories as close to fact as we possibly can get. But even then, I mean, maybe it's too paranoid, but to think that documents, it's very easy to see how documents can be corrupted. I've done it unintentionally before. I mean, when you're, scribes writing down a history that someone else has recorded, was it Tacitus who was against, or didn't consider it history unless you got it from an observer who was there, essentially an oral history type situation. Going back in the von Rankin kind of style of like, we're just going to mine endlessly what's in the archives. It blows my mind that archival theory comes around and was like, well, maybe we can't trust everything that's in our archive.
Well, people have been making stuff up, so there's all kinds of stuff in archives that is in the same way that even in this case, what you've got are different people's opinions about what's happening. And none of them actually figure out what's going on. So there is some sort of phenomenon at work. None of them actually get to the bottom of it. There are undoubtedly the stories that let's call it, the airship cultists are involved in. I mean, those stories are impossible. You can't be true. Okay, you can't go and fly 32,000 miles around the Earth, because the Earth is only 25,000 miles. So if you go and you travel for 32,000 miles, where are you going? Okay, and then how do you end up in this different land where people with big heads have superior technology? I mean, is he talking about the hollow Earth? Mm-hmm. Or is he talking about another? It's kind of close for another planet. I don't know how that. So, and that's part of it, is that the stories are impossible. It could not possibly be true. And yet you have people who adamantly swear to them that they're all kinds of, and if they're just making it up, they end up in a good deal of, eventually, Van Valkenburg and the others are on trial, in federal court. The feds are trying to frame you for one thing or another, inciting draft evasion, being crazy, whatever it is. So at that point, all you have to do to get yourself out of this trouble is go, okay, I just made it up. Mm-hmm. But they don't. They double down on everything. And they'll even give these answers. Van Valkenburg gives this whole answer when he claims to have been operating one of the craft on a night when he was under double surveillance, and we've got people who are watching you every minute, and you never left the house. So how could this happen? And he goes, well, I did. I don't know how that happened to you, but that's actually what it is that happened. Why stick? Why invent that story to begin with, and then why stick to a completely impossible story?
Well, I mean, you've looked at enough of these cases that seem to have a similar theme, at least. I mean, are these folks just out and out charlatans, or are they a little crazy? Are they? I mean, what would be your explanation for why someone would do that?
Well, if you're a charlatan and you're a con man, then your goal is to eventually get money out of somebody.
Right.
And while there is this kind of sort of half-hearted attempts by some of these guys to get money out of people, they never seem to try very hard, and they never seem to get anything. So if it was a con, obviously they don't know how to run a con, with the exception that apparently they know how to stick to the con. So
Mm-hmm.
this is one of the things about, you always stick to the con, and that is you never depart from the story. You always continue to insist that it's true. Uh, I chalk it up to that, at least in the Van Valkenburg case, that he actually believes this on some level. So how is that possible? How do you believe something that doesn't seem to have any basis in fact? And the only way that that would work for me is if he had been subjected to hypnotic suggestion.
Okay.
Yeah, that they had been hypnotized, whatever that is exactly, and convinced that these experience that false experiences were implanted in their mind, so that to them it's real.
So maybe I probably missed. Am I echoing on your end?
No.
Okay. Um, so maybe I missed this. I have the article open, which
Yeah.
yeah, I will find a way to post it in the show, in the notes.
I think I make one brief mention of hypnotic, and I just because
Right.
okay, and that when I say that, I'm just spitballing. I'm just saying what's a possible way to explain this? The only way I can think of it is that if someone was personally convinced that their experiences were real, that the whole
Sure.
memory occurred to them, this is what happened to them, and you put yourself, if you were in that situation, if this is real to you, then it's difficult to say that it didn't happen.
So make sure I got the chronology of this whole thing right. So there, essentially, there's reports that there's lights in the sky. These characters come around and claim that they have a device from.
Well, they publish it in the whole thing goes over about a year.
Okay.
Basically runs from around June 1917 to June 1918. And it all begins sometime earlier, probably I think about maybe about April or May of 1917, the spring of that year, when various reports eventually reach Salt Lake City and the Bureau of Investigation office headed by Leon Bone, of people seeing strange things in the night sky. And what they generally describe is that sometimes the craft seem to make a noise. Sometimes there's like a buzzing noise. That often they don't seem to make a noise. But there's a light, which is, it's a typical sort of, the light will sometimes move very rapidly, or it will make zigzag. It will move in a kind of erratic. This type of thing that later will be described as flying saucers doing.
Mm-hmm.
It moves, and it's not moving like a bird. It's not moving like a plane. But keep in mind, this is 1917, and anything with lights on it in the sky other than heavenly bodies is really unusual. Mm-hmm. It's even more unusual in the wilds of Utah. There just aren't many planes around. There aren't a lot of planes with bright lights. Right. And it can hover. It can be stationary or it can move rapidly. Now that's one of the things that anything short of a dirigible in that, which there's none of those in Utah. Okay, the Navy, they check on this. Does the Navy have a secret airship hangar? No, there's nothing like that. So an airplane can't stay in one spot. Like a shark, it has to keep constantly moving or it falls out of the eye. So it can't just stop and then move again. So the whole movement of these craft is quite consistent with what 30 years later, when we get to 1947 and you get to the saucer reports that become, it's the same sort of thing. The light component is sometimes it will be like a searchlight, which someone will play on the ground. In other cases, it's just kind of like a little blue light moving around in the sky. So these reports had come in, and it's around July of 1917 that Bone has collected. Initially, he just think, oh, this is just people imagining things. That's the way, the people just thought they saw something, had too much to drink. And keep in mind, this is also Utah, where per capita, probably fewer people are drinking than might be otherwise. There are people drinking, I'm sure of it, many of them Mormons.
Right.
Less so. Okay. Drunkenness, delirium tremens doesn't work quite as well in Utah as it does elsewhere. So Bowen's got enough of these reports, and then he gets one from the sheriff in Moab, way down in the southeastern part of the state. Now, Bowen knows the sheriff of Moab, and he knows him as a solid citizen, a guy who wouldn't make something up. So when the sheriff in Moab says, yeah, there were 4 of these things, and they were like flying over the LaSalle Mountains, and they looked like they were signaling to each other because the lights would go on and off, but it wasn't Morse code. It was just, they were sort of flashing back and forth. So, and this is a typical thing. So what it was is that Bone tended to discount these until he got an account from someone he knew and trusted. And then he began to look at the other ones and sort of notice that they're all kind of describing the same phenomenon. Then someone, I don't know who, points out that, well, a couple of weeks before, back in, I think, June of 1917, there was an article that ran in the Salt Lake City Evening Tribune, which was mentioning that this, it was getting some sort of newspaper accounts, and it mentioned this guy, John Van Valkenburg, who said he and his friends were the inventors and operators of these craft. So Van Valkenburg and the others had before gone to the press, claimed that they were the men behind these lights, and Bone sort of goes back and looks at it and goes, well, I need to interview them. And he does. He brings them in and begins to talk to them. And while never being shown any physical evidence whatsoever. So keep in mind, in the weeks and months that follow, Leon Bone never sees any of these craft. He never sees anything in operation. It's unclear whether he ever sees any lights in the sky himself. But he's completely taken in by the story that Van Valkenburg and his accomplices tell him. And this is the story about how they received this kind of miraculous fist-sized technology with rotating discs inside that allows them, as they put it, to essentially annihilate gravity. It's an anti-gravity device. And they'll mention this again and again, that somehow these rotating discs cancel out gravity.
So,
and yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay. So, I mean, what are you, as far as you know, what are the? I've never read Jules Verne, but what's the popular culture like in this period around anti-gravity? I would assume that anybody who is aware of gravity, and I'm sure probably people know about Isaac Newton and are discussing, gravity in that regard. But it just seems, these are kind of ideas maybe ahead of their time. At least that's what it feels like to me.
It makes a lot of. There's a book by Nick Cook called The Search for Zero Point. Ever heard of there's a thing called zero point energy, which I'm not sure I fully understand. But it's just sort of latent energy that exists everywhere and will become and can be drawn and concentrated. Which is, it sounds vaguely similar to what these guys say, that with the energy, it just sort of comes out of the air. That there's no fuel source, that these rotating discs just apparently just draw on some kind of what they tend to think is an electrical energy, but they don't really know.
Well, I mean, is the concept of the ether, I mean, neither of us are historians of science or anything like that, but I mean, the ether is something that I know is around in the 30s. People are talking about it like that. Do you think they're discussing the same thing?
That term doesn't. The closest you get to it is a very popular author this time is Edgar Rice Burroughs. who's most noted for his Tarzan stories. But Burroughs is also writing in this period, 1914, 1912. He's writing his Mars novels, his Barsoom novels, and he's writing his Pellucidar novels about the Earth. And so that could be where some of the whole, I mean, he's the only one who's going on the idea that there's some kind of, the Earth is a hollow sphere, and there's a whole other world inside of it. But Burroughs helped popularize that idea. And in his Barsoom novels that take place on Mars, the Martians are always flying around in what essentially look like floating battleships. That's what they have. They have these floating airships, which are powered by the miraculous eighth ray of Barsoom.
Okay.
So I'm not going to try to explain his physics. Somehow it was like there's a particular buoyancy ray that you can extract from sunlight, and then you can put it into a tank, and that then attached to your ships will make them float. Mm-hmm. Which also sounds oddly like the whole Sonora Aero Club NIMSA soup thing.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think anybody who observes ufology or kind of UFO lore, there seems to be a crazy amount of influence from contemporary science fiction, and so that's something that I didn't think of, I guess, after the fact. Because when does science fiction really come around as a unique genre? I would assume I thought it was like the 20s, but maybe it's the teens.
A lot of it comes out of the pulp magazines in the 20s and 30s.
Okay.
And into the 40s, astounding science fiction.
Right.
Ray Palmer is the editor who does much to really sort of create science fiction.
So does it strike you that maybe some of these ideas are being pulled from kind of contemporary, this emergence of some of these ideas in literature, or was there something a little bit more?
Well, they find a couple. Okay, they search Van Valkenburg's house, and so they tend to find every kind of book you can find. And I think I mentioned some of them. They find a book about how they built the pyramids. So there's a book on pyramid power. And at one point earlier, one of the, we'll call them the airship cultists, say that the power that's used to move us around in the craft are the same ones that Jesus and Moses used for things like parting the Red Sea. But it's also the same power that was used to build the pyramids.
Okay.
Then later in Van Valkenburg's library, you find a book on pyramid power, and also a lot of stuff on astrology. That seems to have, because before Bone is sort of admitted into the inner circle of this cult, they want to do his whole astrological chart. Everyone who's admitted to this has to have their astrological chart done. Some of the adept insist this is the case. So there's that angle to it. But then they also find there's a writer by the name of Arthur Train. I'd never heard of him. But in 1915, he wrote a book called The Man Who Rocked the World, and then a year later, a book called The Moonmaker. So in the first one, The Man Who Rocked the World, it's all about a kind of, Jules Verne-like mad scientist called Pax, P-A-X, who wants to, wants to get rid of war. It's sort of like Jules Verne's Robar character, who also, in Master of the Air, whatever it is, builds this whole huge airship that goes around trying to destroy war-making power on Earth. This idea has been around at least since Verne. But what it is that Pax invents is something he calls the flying ring. And in the story, the flying ring can simply ascend into the air almost instantaneously, which is exactly what it is that these guys describe their craft being able to do. That it can just, ground level, it can go right up to the mothership. Virtually, it's unlimited in the amount of speed that it can have. And so this similarity between the flying ring described in the book, even though what they're describing isn't the same, it's not a flying ring, It's apparently a flying barrel,
Mhm.
but its behavior in the same way could suggest where he got the idea from, that he's getting part of this from the stories that he's been reading, sort of early science fiction stories. But here again, you're doing the same thing of trying to make these pieces fit together. So, like so many other things in history or otherwise, you got a bunch, you got like a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, and it's just sort of scattered out in front of you, and you really don't know what it is that there's no box, so you have no picture to tell you what it's supposed to be. So you have no idea how these pieces actually go together, or whether they actually do go together. So you just start trying to find something that will make something recognizable out of it. And if you have to, maybe you start, cutting it a little bit. That would kind of help. And that just makes things more difficult. Okay, once you do that, once you start cutting the
Right.
pieces together. But there's this constant desire to make sense out of this. So we got this whole sort of apparently this nonsensical story that's being told about an airship that can do things that are completely impossible for anyone to do in 1917 or now, told by people who seem to adamantly believe it, who don't seem to be running any kind of actual con, present no physical evidence of anything that they claim to absolutely believe. So you've got to, so for instance, the federal prosecutors that go after these guys decide that they're all somehow, this is some sort of German intrigue, that all of these stories are a cover, a camouflage for some kind of insidious plot by the Kaiser, even though they admit they have no idea what this would be.
Well, let me pause you. So, what is their basis for being able to go after these guys in the first place?
Well, what do the feds need to go after you? Well, there's a war on. Okay.
Okay. All right.
So
I
I don't think that's incidental to this. So remember, the U.S. just entered the war in April 1917.
Right.
And so remember, all of this story is now coming up just in the weeks and months following.
Mm-hmm.
So Leon Bone really begins to dig into this whole case in late July and in early August. So the U.S. is still, it's just sort of getting worked up into the whole sort of war hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
And what goes along with that is spy mania. And this is, everyone's looking for German spies, because the Germans had been engaging in sabotage in the U.S. and still were. So, could this possibly be some sort of German plot? And so, but they don't know what from the standpoint, but there was no war industry in Utah, for instance. I mean, nothing's being produced there. So why would German agents be interested in creating a cover story about fantastic aircraft?
Right.
What would that be covering up?
So Bone, essentially Bone says, these guys are claiming that they have invented this new sort of craft. I'm going to interview them and then turn their houses over.
Well, Bone believes it. Bone becomes, in his letters, in the reports that he sends back to Washington to Bureau Chief Bruce Belaski. And by the way, he and Bruce Belaski, a little background on Bone. Bone was, he was a lawyer by training. Both he and Belaski were graduates of Georgetown Law School. Okay. They were classmates. They were in the same fraternity. Mm-hmm. They were both Freemasons. Everyone in this story is a Freemason.
Okay.
So actually, let's just comment like, who's afraid? They all are.
Okay.
So, Bone is not some sort of, don't sort of imagine this is like, Marshall Dillon in Gunsmoke, who has no idea what's going on. This is some sort of rube. He's, for whatever it's worth, he's a Georgetown Law School graduate. He was a practicing attorney. He had been involved up until very recently in investigations in the so-called Hindu conspiracy in California. And that was a German financed Indian nationalist plot. The whole idea was that the Germans were working together with activists from the Ghadar Party, Indian Nationalist Party, to load up a ship with arms and ship them to India to start a rebellion. And because that was argued to violate American neutrality laws, they all ended up in a courtroom in San Francisco for a thing, for anyone who's interested, called the California Hindu conspiracy trial.
Okay.
So that's a whole thing on its own.
Gonna write that down.
So Bone was involved. He'd actually been involved in investigations. He wasn't, on the other hand, a Utah native. He doesn't seem to quite maybe fit into the local culture as well as some of the other ones did. So, he reads this article in the newspaper where these guys claim that, Van Valkenburg says, I and my, buddies, we built these things. So he talks to them and they lay out the whole story. Yeah, there's this, magic man, the adept, the above one, and he gave us this technology and he powers it and controls things and he sends messages to me,
Where's he do?
And Van Valkenburg says, I'm the only one who's ever met the adept, and I'm actually the only one who's ever flown in these things. But I have other friends who can back up what I say, even though they never met the adept and they've never flown in them. And so he brings in two other guys, a guy named Charles Henderson and Ed Althoff. And Ed Althoff is another Freemason, but he's not just a Freemason. He is a brother of Leon Bone's lodge. In fact, Bone has known him for 5 years.
Okay.
Lodge buddies. So to Bone's huge surprise, when Van Valkenburg goes, oh, here's this guy that can back me up, and in walks this guy he's never mentioned anything about this before. And that's what convinces the Bureau of Investigation agent Bone that this must be true, because Althoff, as a friend and brother Mason, wouldn't lie to him about this. So Bone then begins writing to Belaski, arguing these guys really are onto something, and they need to perfect their invention, and then they're going to turn it over to the government. Now, Belaski's interested in this. And he goes, well, yeah, we got to, the U.S. government certainly would be, because it's not just that these little craft can fly 1,000 miles an hour. In fact, their speed appears to be unlimited. You can fly from Salt Lake City to San Francisco in a half an hour. It says you can ascend into space. You can get into one of them and you can travel 32,000 miles to this completely other land where there's this civilization, which have all kinds of more miraculous stuff. Oh, but that's not all. Those lights we have in there? Well, those aren't just lights; they're death rays. You can use that to melt entire mountains. Okay, we could just train one of our lights on a mountain and we could melt the entire thing. So imagine what we could do to the German army with one of those.
Right, or what they could do.
Okay, now the minute somebody in Washington hears about super weapons and death rays, well, they're going to be kind of interested. So Belaski goes, well, talk to them, figure out what's going on, turn this over, and so as the weeks and months go by, through the end of 1917 into early 1918, Bone keeps saying, well, when are you going to show me one of these things? Well, we have to, got to work out a few bugs, do things that are perfected. And of course, we also have to get the adept's permission. And he's not too keen about having his technology, his super technology, placed in the hands of people who would use them for war. Because his ultimate goal is to bring about universal peace through universal brotherhood. And so this is now where Bone begins to learn that these guys aren't just, they haven't just gotten this technology. They've also formed their whole organization, which at first he thinks is just the 3 guys. Then he finds out that there are actually 9 people involved. And then by the time that he quits counting, he finds out that there are 22 members of this group. They're all sworn to secrecy. Almost all of them are Mormons to one degree or another. And they all meet out about 180 miles away from Salt Lake City, out in this little railroad town called Milford, which is, for some reason, they're just kind of out there. That's some particular significance to them. And so there are 20 odd members of this. They all have to have their astrological charts done. They're also given different mental and physical tests to see whether or not they're worthy of this. And so their whole idea is that they will go out and they will recruit more people, and then they will bring the ones who are worthy in, and they will learn the secrets of the adept. And then this whole society will spread, and this will be the way in which the adept will spread his message of peace and brotherhood. But in the meantime, we have to keep this, potentially very dangerous technology secret. I don't know. Why did he give it to them to begin with? Right? The other thing that never makes any sense is that they keep saying they have to perfect the invention. But they've already said, we've got 4 of these,
Right.
and we're flying around, so just take one and give it to them. No, we can't do it. Well, the simple answer to that is because they don't have any. Okay, there are no flying machines. Keep in mind, there are lights in the sky that people are seeing.
Right.
That phenomenon is real. These guys are simply claiming that they're the source of that through this superior, let's call it alien technology that presumably they have, but they never demonstrate any of it. So no one ever sees anything. No one other than Van Valkenburg and one other guy claims to ever have actually seen the discs. But he adamantly, Van Valkenburg believes his own story, and he has somehow convinced other people that what he has said is completely true. And that appears to be the same thing with the Bureau of Investigation. Bone. Bone now believes, he thinks they're on to something. Now that's when trouble begins to arise, because Bone had been sharing a lot of his investigation with the U.S. attorney in Salt Lake City, a guy by the name of William Ray. They were sort of friends, and Ray is very skeptical of the whole thing. Ray initially, for a long time, Ray continued to insist that people who claimed they were seeing things in the sky were just, drunk or imagining things. He eventually comes around and says, well, I guess they were seeing something. But Ray eventually becomes concerned because Bone seems to believe these guys. And so Ray begins to think that, well, I think that Leon has just kind of, he's fallen down the rabbit hole and he's lost all objectivity. So Ray then writes also back to DC to Bureau Chief Pulaski and says, I think Bone's gone off the rails here. And while he seems very convinced of this, I think that he's again lost objectivity. You need to bring somebody in to investigate this. And they do. They bring a Bureau of Investigation guy from Los Angeles, Robert Whitson. He's moved in without telling Bone, by the way, because this is the whole little scheme that the feds have now. This now is about the beginning of 1918. Doubts have arisen as to whether or not Bone is a reliable narrator, whether or not he's now gone too far into this to be objective. But we don't want the airship men, as they call them, to get wind that we're going to look at we have another investigation going. So we're going to let him continue to do this while we bring in Whitson from LA and his investigators, and then they're going to start following everybody.
Jeez.
So there'll be 2. So there's one feds. Okay, there's a Bureau of Investigation agent who is spying on the other Bureau of Investigation agent, is now gone full Fox Mulder and is joined there. That doesn't work because somehow or another, both Bone and Van Valkenburg and the others figure out almost immediately they're being followed. I guess because they were being followed. So that doesn't work. You've got another guy who's the postmaster of Salt Lake City, a guy named Noble Warren, who is now writing letters to the governor and going everywhere and he's now convinced that this whole thing is part of the nefarious German plot. And if we don't do something about it right away, Utah will be set on fire. We'll wake up one morning and every warehouse in the state will be burning because German agents have done this because Bone is an incompetent investigator, and we have to get to this, and we have to stomp out this conspiracy before it gets any further. At one point, Bone, and he does this with Belasky's permission. So Bone has told Belasky that he thinks these guys are really onto something, that there's some sort of real invention that they have. So he asks Belasky, should I give them some kind of, something that would, some sort of protection? And Belasky says, yeah, you can give them some sort of letter or something that would give them protection. So what Bone does, with the approval of his chief in Washington, is to give each of them, it's mentioned in the article somewhere, let me find it so I can actually read it. Okay, so he gives Van Valkenburg and a couple of others a little letter that says, to whom it may concern, the bearer is hereby authorized to perform special services for the government of the United States and should be permitted to do his work without molestation or hindrance whatsoever.
Okay.
So here's the question. Did Leon Bone, federal agent, just in a sense federally deputized Van Valkenburg? I mean, he authorized them. Does he actually have the power to do it? Well, see, this is what you asked later on. What do the feds trying to prosecute Van Valkenburg? There's one is the argument that they were falsely presenting them. They were impersonating federal agents.
Okay.
But their lawyer, they had one, simply said, well, there's a letter. Okay, Bone, who is a federal agent, says that we've got a whole trail here, and somebody in Washington said they should have letters, and this was given to them. So they're not really impersonating federal agents, are they? They're just carrying these letters around with them. In the same way that they try to go after Van Valkenburg for violating the Espionage Act by counseling a young man to not register for the draft. So the Espionage Act was this whole thing that was brought in 1917 to essentially clamp down on anybody questioning the war effort. And you could either be sentenced to death or 20 years in prison. And one of those things was in any way interfering with conscription.
Okay.
So Van Valkenburg, turns out, one of the things they do figure out in their investigation, he's having an affair with a married woman.
Okay.
So he's, kind of divorced, although not. Remember, he's supposedly a good Mormon.
Right.
I don't know. He's trying to collect another wife or something. So, and he tells the woman that he's getting a divorce. But it's this whole thing. So they think maybe they could get him on adultery charges, but those won't really work. But he tells her son, who's wondering whether he should register for the draft. He goes, well, you wouldn't have to register for the draft because, see, I've got this letter. I'm a federal agent, and I can get you a job with the Secret Service. And if you're in the Secret Service or you're working with me, then you don't have to register for the draft. And so the idea was that, well, does that actually violate the Espionage Act? So they don't really do that. So what do they eventually get them on? They don't do anything. They both Van Valkenburg and one of the others, I think it's Charles Henderson. They have them examined by shrinks.
Okay.
So they bring in a panel of they go down to Provo, where the state mental hospital is, and they bring in some psychiatrists, and they examine them, and they find that both of these men suffer from selective paranoid delusions. That is, in every other thing, they seem to be, I think the report actually says, they seem to be perfectly sane and rational. But when it comes to this airship business, well, obviously they're crazy. Okay. So they're just kind of crazy about this one thing. So we're going to send them down to Provo until they get over this one thing.
Wow.
And so both of them ended up committed, forcibly committed.
Yeah.
Because they're apparently crazy about one thing, and they're there for about a month, and then somehow they get a letter that says they're cured, and they're let go.
Okay.
So, and then nobody ever mentions this again. So Van Valkenburg lived on, he and his family eventually moved to L.A. He's still alive. The census of 1930 shows that he's retired and he's living with his daughter and son-in-law. There's no other press accounts that he ever mentions anything about airships, adepts, any of that ever comes up. Another one of the key figures, Ed Althoff, he dies in 1974, I think in uh, El Dorado, California. I think it's where, he's
Yeah.
still a good Freemason at that time.
Mm.
And I did track down someone who was one of Althoff's, I don't know, great niece or something like that. And it was like, there was any sort of family lore about him ever talking about this? No,
Hmm.
never heard of it before. Never, as far as I mean, I don't think she knew him very well,
Yeah.
but no one had ever talked to him about the other ones, Henderson and the rest of it. None of them are ever mentioned in context with us again. So here's an interesting question: what the hell was going on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of a good topic to start with when you talk about mystery, because is it? I mean, there's so many layers there when you're talking about these are all good Mormons, they're all good Freemasons, and yet they have this fantastical story with an actual documented case of strange lights in the sky, but it all seems to kind of unravel very quickly, and it makes me wonder, what if, I mean, do they see these things and start to come up with this entire, cosmology about, how they were involved in it somehow, or was it, what do you think it ultimately?
Well, there are lots of questions. I mean, what is it that they eventually say in Provo that convinces that they're so essentially they must disavow the story?
Right.
I mean, at some point, basic self-preservation would come around to the point that if I keep sticking to this story, they're going to keep me in the loony bin. So maybe, in other words, I'm not so crazy that I can't change my story in order to get out, which means that you were probably never crazy to begin with.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Well, there's a couple of others. See, there are different levels to this. So again, the file just basically consists of the correspondence and reports that are going back and forth from the different federal officials who are involved. And at one point, remember, Bone requests essentially giving them some sort of letter that would give them protection. And Bilasky asked Bone, do you think it would be a good idea for them to talk to somebody from the War Department? Okay, should we find some, because we're Bureau of Investigation. So maybe there's someone in the Pentagon who might, could we send out a couple of people from the Military Intelligence Division to talk to these guys? So that question is simply raised. It's proposed. There's nothing in the correspondence of the file that I can see in which it says that any kind of military, any MID guys were ever sent out, whether the Pentagon was ever informed of this. But then there's a mention in some of the later depositions by, one of the airship men, one of the cultists, let's call them. Back in January 1918, Van Valkenburg and I, we talked to these two guys from Washington. We spent several hours talking to these guys, which are none of you, by the way. These were guys who came here. Well, this seems to be complete news to Whitson, the BI agents who's trying to frame them as German spies, and he can't figure out who these guys were, whether an interview took place.
Mm-hmm.
So, putting the little pieces together without cutting too many parts off, one could speculate that news of this miraculous invention was passed on to someone in the War Department, into the Military Intelligence Division or some other part of the Army, and that a couple of people, again, separate from all the others, came out to talk to them. So that there might, in fact, have been another federal investigation going on, other than the two that were there already. And you could go to the holiday. They talk to them. Did these guys ever get their hands on something? And this was then why they sort of encouraged that in the end, the idea was to make these guys shut up. Mm-hmm. That's eventually what is accomplished in this case. Because remember, the whole thing started because Van Valkenburg and his friends, Althoff, went to the press and claimed that they were the source of this. So they like talking about it, and they'll talk to it about Bone, and they'll talk about everyone else. And they keep talking, and they keep talking, and they keep talking. When Whitson gets a hold of them and says, "You're lying, and I know you're lying because you couldn't have done what you said you did because I was watching you the whole time," and they insist they were, they keep talking. What then changes is that eventually the two principals get sent to Provo,
Yeah.
and then they somehow agree to quit talking and are released. So was this in the end is what the whole goal was, to make them shut up about any of this and make the whole story go away. And why? I mean, if there's no story, if there's no there,
Yeah.
why do you want to make people, stop telling a story that no one in their right mind would believe to begin with?
Well, I mean, how much of it, when you talk, mentioned Bone and the other investigation, kind of looking at him and saying this guy's gone off his rocker, he's lost, objectivity. I mean, how much of it was it kind of a cleanup job, you think, to maybe save reputations? And
He could have been. Bone is transferred to L.A.
Mm-hmm.
in May of 1918. So eventually there's enough pressure that he's essentially relieved and he's sent off. He's very upset about that. And his argument is that there's two things. He writes letters to Belaski, and when he's in his reports to Belaski, Bone is saying, "I really believe these guys are onto something." He never says he knows exactly what it is. But he later complains, once he's been relieved of his investigative duties, that, I was trying to infiltrate this group, and I had to win their confidence to do that. And so I never really, he claims, I never believed everything they were saying, but I thought they were on to something. I was trying to figure out what that was. And to do that, I had to get inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that pretty well until you brought Whitson along, and with what he described as his stupid ham-fisted tactics, okay, he destroyed everything. And now we'll never get to the bottom of it. Because Whitson simply came in and started arresting people and threatening them.
Yeah.
And eventually, because he couldn't do anything, because he couldn't actually prosecute them for any crime, and he couldn't prove that any kind of espionage had taken place, he just decided to, condemn them to an insane asylum until they agreed to recant. And he goes, "Now we'll never figure out what's going on. And had you let me continue with what I was doing, I might." Now, maybe that's true. Maybe he's just trying to maybe he was, he does seem pretty damn credulous early on for someone who's never seen any trace of this stuff.
Well, I was going to say, so the reports of lights were essentially, this investigation, Bone and the other, were happening well after the lights had stopped appearing, right?
No, they never stopped.
They never stopped.
No. These reports go on periodically all the way into 1918, and they probably continued on after that.
That's kind of was wondering.
And it's one of the things that Bone points out. He goes, "Look, while all this is going on, we're still getting these. This is what started this.
Yeah.
All I started out trying to do was to figure out what these reports about lights in the sky, what was going on. This seemed to offer an explanation, because these guys claimed responsibility. So I followed that and tried to pursue that lead. Whitson came in and has now completely screwed everything up, so we're never going to go that way." And he points out, in the meantime, here's more reports of lights in the sky.
So that's interesting. So, I mean, do you have a sense of, maybe this is, too much speculation, so you can turn it down, but do you have an idea of maybe what
was actually going on? I have no idea. I mean, I can come up with different stories. Okay, I can come up with this scenario or that scenario. You could probably boil things down to a certain limited number of problems. One, it's a hoax or it's a scam.
With lights in the sky, though?
Oh, I mean, with the lights in the sky?
Yeah.
What those are? I don't know. Does anybody know? I mean, look, this is the same thing. People still report those today.
Yeah.
They never reported. What they were, I don't know. Again, there aren't a lot of airplanes flying around in Utah.
Right.
I mean, one of the first things that Bone did, both he and Ray, when this whole thing first came up, in the summer of 1917. They go to Fort Douglas,
Okay.
which is the main military, and there's an airfield there. And they go to the commander of that. And they go, you got like a fleet of Zeppelins or some planes around here. He goes, what? We don't have any aircraft. And they go, well, so they figured out that the nearest sort of air base is in San Diego.
Wow.
So is it possible people could be flying planes from San Diego and landing them here? And the idea was, what for?
Yeah.
So the military says, we don't know anything about this. It's ridiculous. We were not operating any air. So there might have been, you'd have to assume that in the whole state, in the whole Great Basin area in 1917, how many functional airplanes could there have been?
I wouldn't even want to wager a guess.
I could say none.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
There would be very, very few. And the ones that could carry out the kind of maneuvers, the maneuvering of these lights aren't, some of them could have been airplanes, but there just aren't any airplanes for them to be.
Yeah.
This is the difference between today, when you have all kinds of aircraft, satellites, everything else. None of those things existed in 1917. There's no reason for there to be anything flying around, 10,000 feet in the air, shining a light.
Mm-hmm.
That just doesn't happen. But there was.
And these reports go on for over a year. And I'm sorry to harp on this, but when it comes to airship stuff, and even, things that are happening afterwards, you don't necessarily have the technological prowess, to be doing this. And so it always elicits that kind of question, are people just making this up? Is this a form of hysteria where people are kind of reporting, oh yeah, I saw it too? Or is it something, I don't know.
Well, there was the sheriff in Moab. That's one of the things that caught Leon Bone's attention, because this was a guy he knew was, sober, wouldn't make this up.
Mm-hmm.
He said he saw four of these lights around the LaSalle Mountains. The other reports tended to be similar. I think there was one sort of aerial display over Logan,
mm-hmm.
in which there were hundreds of people who said that they'd seen the same thing. There were ranchers, judges.
Okay.
It's not just some guy with, a bottle of bourbon out with his burro. That's just some miner out in the back of that who's doing this. So some of them probably were people imagining things. But again, from 1917, there aren't a lot of things to misconstrue.
Right.
So in 1947, there are all kinds of things there are airplanes
mm-hmm.
everywhere, relatively speaking. So it's possible to misconstrue all kinds of things. But in the night skies over Utah in 1917, there aren't a lot of things that you can mistake for this. Yeah. So while many, maybe even, you can say that the majority of these reports are people who just thought they saw something and they didn't. But, really to come up with the idea that everybody's just imagining it is that's just being lazy, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah.
What you're basically saying is, I can't explain this, and because I can't explain it, it doesn't exist.
Well, I think it immediately takes people to a place that, if they want to, claim they're rational in some ways, they can't allow themselves to engage with any other kind of explanation other than, well, people just were imagining it, which I'm not advocating for. I'm just thinking in terms of, let's start there with. Well,
I'll come back with this. What does it mean to say that I imagined something?
Well, I was, not knowing it well, but I think everybody thinks about the dancing sickness when you talk about mass hysteria. So this, kind of a word of mouth. Well, I saw this thing. Can't you convince the person next to you that they're also seeing this thing? Now, when you talk about hundreds of people at a time, people with strong moral, character or, high, social reputation, like a judge or a sheriff or whatnot. Even today, when you talk about UFOs, those are some of the
It becomes easy, but then explain to me what mass hysteria is.
That's what I'm saying.
Explain to me the physics of how that works. Exactly.
Yeah, that's
okay. Because if there is a thing called mass hysteria, there must be a mechanism, a process by which it operates.
Well, the only way that I've understood, not even called mass hysteria, but like it would necessitate some kind of overarching authority disseminating a narrative, and here you clearly don't have that. So, we can all agree.
If it gets popular to say I saw something, yes, you're going to have people who go to the newspaper office and say I said something because it'll get their name in the newspaper.
Right.
But they wouldn't be doing that unless someone else had reported that before. You get the copycat element, but you can't copy something until there's been sort of an original, which is there. And I'm not trying to make some sort of huge case that everybody that says, I don't know, I wasn't there, I didn't see anything. I'm in my whole experience, I've never seen anything in the night sky that didn't seem to be pretty much explainable.
Yeah.
In one form or another. But that doesn't mean I don't believe that other people do. I mean, it seems to be relatively common. So, without on the one hand endorsing every single report of strange lights in the sky as being implicitly true, because you can't do that, in the same way, given the sheer number of them, it doesn't seem reasonable to argue that everybody was just hallucinating this.
Yeah.
There was something, the whole thing started because there was stuff that was getting people concerned. And that, again, Bowen just wanted to get to the bottom of this. And, getting to the bottom of it, but he found all of this other weirdness that just gets stranger and stranger and stranger.
Well, and so kind of going back from, the original question. So what do you think was going on with the actual, airship men themselves?
The airship men, well, again, it was a hoax or a con. And I don't think you can totally dismiss that. I mean, did they just all get together and decide this would be a great story to tell for attention? Well, that would make sense to the point that you get in trouble about it. Okay. Yeah. The minute I was basically being interrogated by federal agents and threatened with prosecution for being a spy, I kind of figured that the fun had gone out of this. I mean, all you have to do is go, oh, okay, we just made it up. So, I mean, if you just admit it's a lie, you're not even committing perjury. All right. Doing that. So that it was just a hoax. I don't see why someone would stick with a hoax, and especially such a improbable hoax. It's the same question I have in so many sort of UFO things. It's like, couldn't you come up with a better story? There's a case in the 1950s of the guy named Truman Bethram, and he describes his contact with the space beings from the planet Clarion, planet which doesn't actually exist, so far as you can tell. Well, it's the one hiding behind the sun. That's okay. It's always on the other side of the sun. And but in which he describes the spacemen dressed, their uniforms look like Greyhound bus drivers. Okay. And the commander of them is, of course, a beautiful redheaded space captainess named Aura Raines.
Okay.
Which he has some kind of romance with.
Of course.
His wife actually divorces him because he claimed.
There's another situation like that. I thought, was it George? Not Fantastic. Gosh.
Adamski?
No, I'm sorry.
No.
Well, this is
they're all named George.
Well, I know. There's the three famous Georges. No, I'm thinking of the author, Peele. And so there was a case. I thought there was a case that was essentially, the 60s or 50s, of an airship coming down on the way to the skies. They did an Amazon. What was that? It was like a 2-season series. They're in like Appalachia somewhere, and Indrid Cold.
Oh, well, that's Mothman.
I know. But
okay,
there's a character. There's a real person in there who I think swears up and down that he had this affair, essentially with an alien, and his wife left him. I forget.
Seems to happen a lot.
So anyway, sorry.
Well, anyway, the Bethram thing is that I just look at that and I go, what? Just can't you dress them in anything other than Greyhound bus driver uniforms? I mean, why would you come up with that?
Right.
Why was it something that sounds like it's a story that someone would, that's made up? It's it's not just improbable, it's silly. Okay, I'm making a value judgment on that, but yeah, that sounds silly to me. So, then why would you sort of doggedly stick to that story? People come up with sort of strange stuff. So, is it a hoax? Hoax doesn't seem to explain it. They do at one point. Van Valkenburg and the other two principals go to the mayor of Salt Lake City, and they actually ask him for $8,000, which doesn't sound like much, but that's let's play that by 20. So it was some of money. He, by the way, very politely but immediately turns them down. They don't get a penny out of him. Mm-hmm. But their reason for doing that is he said, look, by the way, the question is, what did Van Valkenburg and the others actually do for a living? They were masons for the most part. Okay, they were tile setters.
Okay.
They did that. They dabbled in. One guy, Althoff, was kind of an amateur inventor, which kind of fits into this. Mm-hmm. Some of them had, tried their hand at mining, but basically they were tile setters, sort of specialty masons. But they said that we've been working on this stuff. We've been flying around in the tub for so long that we haven't done any work, which apparently was fun. Okay. So, can we get some money? Now, why they thought the mayor of Salt Lake City was going to give them money to continue their airship research, I don't know.
Interesting.
And which you didn't do. And they don't make the most that Whitson, the antagonistic, the Fred, prosecutor eventually, or the guy who goes after them, the most he could find was that some people had voluntarily lent more, one of them, a few small amounts of money, like $20 or something of that kind. And because he was going to try to get them for extortion. That was the other thing he was looking at. But they weren't extorting anybody.
Successfully.
So it doesn't look like they ever made much of a penny off of it, which again, if it's a con and your goal is to get money and months have passed and you've got no money, then you're going to move on to something else. So if money isn't the object and a hoax that is some sort of sheer just, entertainment, you're just doing it for the hell of it type of thing, that doesn't seem to work. Then what are you left with?
Well, you were saying the church was interested, right? In this.
The Mormon church? Well, there is this little detail. Whitson also discovered that he also realized that these guys weren't working, but he realized that they always seemed to have money. Mm-hmm. So maybe they were getting money somewhere.
Well, I mean,
and maybe the Mormon church was, to add one more strange detail, right, is that at one point in this, I think it's Valkenburg or one of the others that says one of the things that the adept could reveal, knew the secret, was the location of Joseph Smith's skeleton.
Okay.
Because up to this point, this was news to me. I didn't know anything about this. There was the whole when Joseph Smith and his brother were killed, mm-hmm. the bodies were moved around. And no one knew where he was actually buried. They didn't have his physical remains, and apparently it was very important. And there was some sort of like Mormon splinter group that had a skull that they. The guys in Utah didn't believe that was the real skull of the prophet, and they wanted that skull to bring and put in the temple in Salt Lake City.
It's sitting in the.
Okay, now we got prophet skulls and the whole thing, and if he went in and said, I think this guy is floating up in space up there, can tell you, he can pinpoint where Joseph Smith's skeleton is, and he can get his skull. They might have been, right. They might have been down with that, and maybe they paid for that information, but. At some point, the Mormon church, later on, Valkenburg and the rest refer to the church as being very antagonistic. So the church gets quite angry with them. This is why they said their agents are following us and they're kind of out to get us. And maybe that was because certain promises were made about skull delivery for money, which never transpired.
Well, I mean, to me, it's after all the things that you had kind of laid out, that to me seems like the last logical leap is, there's some kind of social, clout, I guess, or monetary value that you can extort from the church itself. If you're in Salt Lake City in 1917 and you're a good Mormon, I don't know. It seems like if you can promise to. I didn't know the skull, which is probably that sounds like it's in some Yale clubhouse somewhere, maybe.
Maybe, or somewhere in the temple in Salt Lake City in a special room. It was the skull room. Okay. And there it is.
Well,
they made a drinking goblet out of it, and who knows? It's possible.
Well, I mean, to me, that just sounds like I mean, I would love. We've talked about this many times. I mean, I would love for it to be something. I'll even take. Kind of the Jungian, it's a egregore, or it's a mental projection, or I'll take that. I would love for it to be something more physical than that. But when it gets these mysteries about, there's the human element, which is messy in its own unique way, but then it's backed up by physical phenomenon that's happening at the same time, and you can just never get to a solid answer, but you can make some inferences about, like, well, what are the real motivations behind some of these actions. It just leaves you wanting, I don't know, finality in some way.
Well, you want to have an answer to it. So, if you look at, again, in terms of the literature, especially the train books that were found in Van Valkenburg's library, you could, we can create a story in which he cobbled together elements of this from stories or other books that he'd read. And that could be the sources. You can kind of see where he might have come up with the basic template for the story. Maybe there is a whole part, and as Whitson and his investigators admitted, they ignored the religious angle completely. They didn't want to get into it. So that may have been where they completely missed where the con was actually going on. Mm-hmm. That this was primarily some sort of Kolob con, which was being run against the Mormon church.
That would be we should do that. Kolokon. Sounds like a great
Kolob con. So that may have, they both he and Bone actually missed what it was that they were up to. But it doesn't explain, again, to me, it doesn't wholly explain why Valkenburg and the others would have stuck to their stories as long as they did. Why they would have let things go that far. You sometimes argue that people stick with it because there's no other, they can't think of anything else to do.
Yeah.
So, but that's just tantamount to saying that I don't have any other explanation for it as to why they would stick with those kind of stories. Which then brings us back to this thing that, again, high in speculation, which not pushing forward as an explanation, but one of the things that might be brought in is that maybe Van Valkenburg believed this story, and others believed their stories as thoroughly as they did, was because to them it was real. Mm-hmm. That they felt that they had actually experienced these things. The only way that I could see that could be accomplished is basically through some sort of suggestion, powerful suggestion to them, essentially hypnotism, that would believe that these things had actually happened to them. But see, that doesn't explain anything, because it then leads to the question is that who the hell hypnotized them?
When you brought it up the first time.
Then why would they hypnotize them with that story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you brought it up the first time, that's exactly what I thought. Is you're in Salt Lake City. You're definitely not in the wilds of Utah, but it's what was the population back then? I'm sure it was 50,000, maybe less.
Yeah, probably less than that.
Yeah, I don't even know what it is now. It's got
20,000, 30,000.
Yeah. So, I mean, hypnotism, as far as I understand it, it's hit or miss. Or am I wrong?
Well, a couple of things there. One, I'm not sure anybody's ever given me a straight answer as to what hypnotism actually is. Mm-hmm. I mean, you still get these questions as to whether or not it exists. And I've talked to people, well, there's no such thing as hypnotism. I've seen people hypnotized. Okay? Something's going on there. People have attempted to hypnotize me. Apparently, I'm one of those the people that doesn't work on.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you get this idea that about 20% of the, let's break it down easier. About a quarter of the population is susceptible to hypnotism, but a quarter of the population is largely
right.
immune from it, and the other half is susceptible to it to one degree or another. So I think it's fair to say that it is possible to mess with with people's heads in a large part of the population. And certainly the CIA spent lots of money studying the MK Ultra, and it worked for them.
Yeah.
They got results out of it.
One stat I saw throughout the 60s was the equivalent of, was it 5 or 10, was it $1 billion? I mean, the equivalent of, at the time. And it wasn't just, obviously hypnotism, but it was psychological research in general, which I think would feed into that. So, there's clearly a value there.
And it comes back, maybe something that might come up again. Otherwise, there is that report I think I showed you from, 1949. It's this sort of meeting, technical meeting in a private office in New York, which a couple of CIA guys come in and they talk about, what they're talking about is hypnotic suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about the value of this as a tool. And that one of the things they say we think we can do with this is to selectively erase memories from people's minds and to implant false memories. Now, that's not to say they say they've done it, but that's what they're thinking about doing. That's what they believe that they can do with that. So, and I think that's something, by the way, that Aleister Crowley would thoroughly have agree with that, in the use of hypnotic. So I think that's one of those things you have to sort of consider lurking around in the background of a lot of UFO cases or paranormal experiences. This idea as to why people often tell these completely improbable or impossible stories that they seem so absolutely convinced of. And that's one possible element that may, of course, it again leaves the question as to who is doing this and why. And you basically would come down to two real possibilities there. One, some sort of governmental or semi-governmental agency.
Right.
Okay, we know that they do that. Okay, that's just exactly what they said they were going to try to do. The other, that some people argue is that, well, the reason why these stories fluctuate so much. You got so again, you could take the 1897 Airship flap, where they seem to be these large sort of, almost, again, Jules Verne flying machines with balloons and propellers, and they appear to be piloted by humans who come down and eat fried chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And you get to 1917, where they're an adept, who's going to bring out, and then going on into the 50s, where again they almost always behave. The Space Brothers are almost they're essentially angels, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what they are?
That's kind of what. Yeah,
they're angels. We're going to save humanity. They're always trying to sell that we're going to bring all this kind of great technology, and we're going to save you from yourselves and aid in your spiritual advancement.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jacques Vallée could argue that, all this is some external force which is appearing to people in whatever way they think will be most acceptable at the time.
Right.
So that in 1897, people saw what they were hypnotized into seeing. In 1917, Van Valkenburg and his friends saw what they were hypnotized in believing that they had seen, except that none of them really did. And then later on, it says, Truman Bethram comes up with his stupid story about spacemen dressed like Greyhound bus because that's what he saw. And you could even argue that one of the reasons why these stories are so often silly and improbable is because that's to make them unconfirmable.
Right. Well, that's when we first met. I had just read. Is it Mac? I'm looking for it on my bookshelf as we speak, but ultra terrestrials. So it's the argument that there is another species living on Earth that we just don't see because they have the ability to be able to essentially, hypnotize us or kind of evade,
Fairies. That's what you're talking about.
Basically.
Yeah, the Fae.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot, I know Valet, I think it was Valet, I forget the book. Was it Passport to Begonia? One of his books talks about, in the Middle Ages, these reports of flying ships that throw anchors down. And, I think it was Valet. Very, very similar to airships of, 1897, and people stopping and, eating your fried chicken and things. I mean, very like corporeal, physical, manifestations, but they're just completely fantastical. And so,
well, it's a good story.
Yeah, that's yeah.
I don't. I think you have to entertain that as a possibility, but that's really the only thing you can do here. You can just entertain it as possibilities. I'll tell you why that this Utah airship mystery particularly intrigues me, other than the fact that I discovered it, I guess. But anyway.
I was just saying, how did you come across this in the first place?
I was searching, okay, you can, there's a website called Full3, which is actually connected to, you can get it through Ancestry, you can get it the same thing. And it's one of these companies that's digitized huge amounts. So they went through and they digitized the old Bureau of Investigation records. It's a paid subscription. You can always get you can always subscribe for free and then quit. But otherwise you have to pay to get access to but it's not that much. And I went through and I was searching for the word airship. And I wasn't looking for this. I was looking for something else. And this came up. Now, by the way, the file itself is simply like many of these Bureau of Investigation files. It's just the title of it is various.
Okay.
So there's nothing in the title that would ever tell you what this is about. And all I knew was that the term airship came in this, and I just started reading it, and there it was. There's this whole sort of story. So what intrigues me about it is that all of this stuff transpires between beginning in the summer of 1917, which is exactly 30 years before Roswell and the flying saucer flap comes up. And there are all kinds of arguments that begin made. That there have been flying saucers all along, and it goes back. But let's put it this way: it's 1947. In the summer of 1947, that people begin seeing discs and saucers, and the press again fuels this. But that's when it enters public consciousness. So it had been going on before, but no one perhaps had paid. But now the press picks it up, popularizes the idea, and it becomes a deal. So what happened back in 1917 is that this was very localized. And it was rather quickly sort of suppressed, and there was no further any comment about it. Now, if this sort of thing began happening all over the country, then it would have been a bigger incident. But to my looking at it, it's the same thing. So if you took what happened, everything we've described happening in 1917, and the experience with these, and you transfer that to 1947 or 1957, you would absolutely say that what was going on here was a UFO contactee experience.
Yeah.
That's what these guys are basically claiming. There's some sort of, there's some sort of like strange magic being way up in the sky who's giving us technology, offering to solve all of our spiritual and temporal problems, is going to create, happiness and brotherhood everywhere. And that's exactly what you get later. But this is 30 years earlier. Which means that all of this, somehow this template was in operation.
Right.
Which then only later on becomes highly popularized.
Did they make any claim that this, the adept was somehow connected to their theology as Mormons, or was it just kind of
No, they eventually they call him Nels.
Yeah.
Nels, and then Nels Olson. There doesn't seem to be one of Agent Bones' criticism of Agent Whitson is that Whitson never interviewed any of the, because if you look up, you go through Ancestry and you find that there are a number of guys. Oddly, there seem to be no shortage of guys named Nels Olson in Utah in 1917. Some of them are too young, some of them are older. They're all Scandinavian immigrants.
Mm.
But there's nothing exceptional about it. One guy's like a teamster, somebody owns this is like some rancher. So there's guys named Nels Olson. Are those the ones? Are they talking about any of these? Oh, by the way, the adept could also do something else interesting. Here's another magical power he had. He could appear in the guise of dead friends and relatives.
Huh. Okay.
He could not appear in the form of a living person, but he could assume the exact likeness of dead loved ones. Where the hell does that come from?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's because it's Utah, and I don't want to be. I've already said things I'm sure that are super wrong about Mormonism, but it seems like maybe that. I mean, would that not be a holdover? Because there is a fixation on family, on the afterlife, on saving people who've, I don't know, just trying to think of a logical thing.
I don't know. Perhaps there are Mormon or ex-Mormon listeners
who could tell you.
Inform. Is there some sort of little super secret thing there about, dead relatives appearing? I mean, what is that?
Is there a thing of cult, is there esoteric Mormonism? I'm sure there is.
Oh, I'm sure there is.
Yeah, that might be.
There must be little aspects of doctrines. Well, I don't think the whole colo thing is, really used as a recruiting tool.
No.
And you have to get into that some ways before. I mean, it's just like Scientology. They don't bring, Lord Xenu,
right,
the Galactic Empire until you get to until you've paid all of your money. Because if they started out with that, no one would go along with it.
Yeah.
It's only and by the way, Lord Xenu and alien ghosts. You've just gone through a high-tech exorcism.
I grew up with, a fairly large and prominent Mormon family in Texas, and all of them went to BYU and became, superstar athletes or something like that. And I remember mentioning something like that, and it was like, well, those are kind of like stories that nobody really, adheres to, kind of thing. But I've wondered, most. Growing up Methodist, all we did was, sit in a pew and eat food. So we weren't particularly interesting. But I've always wondered about, is there an esoteric aspect? And some of the stuff that you're bringing up, I mean, how much influence did things like, spiritualism of the, 1890s and the kind of the Blavatsky stuff? Because some of this feels a little, and maybe that's just Mormonism, I don't know. But some of it feels like it's pulling from other ideas that were, at least I know of, that were in existence. Maybe the early precursor to sci-fi is more significant.
Well, I think you're right. It goes back to what somebody were talking before. I think there is a religious or esoteric aspect to this whole period that Whitson's investigation completely ignored. And that's not to say that would explain everything. It would probably just make it more confusing. Right. If you do that, okay, that's the way these things work. It's not going to clarify it. You're just going to enter into a whole other new realm of weirdness.
Yeah.
And that it's just another rabbit hole over here. But there's probably, I would sort of say almost certainly, okay, that there's more to that than is revealed in the general narrative, which again shows you that the only real record we have of this case is pretty much in this file. That's it, but it's an incomplete record because it's mentioned that it's not, everything is not being explored. Bone never completes his infiltration. Yeah. Whitson never really manages to prove anything. He completely decides to ignore the esoteric aspects of it. That's it. There's no going back to try to retrieve what that was.
I'm fighting the urge to be really lame and plug, as strange as it seems, but it's one of those situations where, all these kind of stories that we've talked about, in the last year and a half, some of the things that you've written on and shown me, they're all, I mean, that's historians. I mean, you tell me, you've obviously been doing this longer. Historians don't always seem to be good with ambiguity in letting things, they want to tie things up in a neat, I mean, if history can be, we're not a science, right? It had a hard time dealing with that kind of, I read a great book years ago about kind of the formalization of the political sciences and how there was this real rejection amongst historians to quantify anything or to try to, even though we tried, Arnold Toynbee and that kind of stuff. So the best that historians can do is make a nice, neat narrative, right? And leave certain things out if it doesn't fit the narrative. And like you're saying, you're opening the door in a lot of cases to something that makes it even messier. So how do you deal with that kind of, like when you run into these topics and there is just no finality? I think we've talked about, when you're doing espionage history, you just kind of run into a wall.
Well, you just accept the fact that there's no finality.
Yeah.
You don't really expect. I mean, you can try to get to the bottom of it as much as you can. But most of it is like that. It's just, everything else. You go through life and you believe the people you believe the stories you want to believe, and you reject the other ones because you don't like them generally.
Right.
You don't like the implications that they have, even though they could possibly be true, which is perfect. So, no, history is not a science. It is a construction of narratives to try to explain things.
Mm-hmm.
So here we've got, so you come back to this one. What have you got? People were seeing weird lights in the sky. Everything else that follows from that, everything we talked about, were different people's half-baked efforts to try to explain things. Mm-hmm. None of which actually succeeds in explaining what it was, what the initial thing was. No one can tell you what those lights were about. Nothing explains that. And it's just that, one way it was put to me, it's a turd on a plate. Why is there a turd on the plate? I don't know, but there's a turd on the plate. And that's the reality that you have to deal with. So what are you going to do with that? Well, you're not going to eat it. You're going to throw it in the trash and wash the plate, probably. But how did the turd get on the plate? I have no idea. So
Fair.
Just accept that it's not certain. That's what makes it interesting. Because if you could explain everything, it would get boring very, very quickly.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. You think that's a good place to end it, or?
I think it's, I guess we could say if this ever sees the light of day, what is it that we're trying to do in these podcasts? Well, it's present more turds on plates. So it was, I was trying to look, I was like definitions for things. So I was looking at definition for strange. Okay, what do we mean by strange? Sure. And so simplest one is that strange is unknown, unfamiliar, or alien. Okay. Right. But there's a better one. That's the one I think we'd be going for here. Is that strange is unusual or surprising in a way that is unsettling or hard to understand.
Okay.
So we talk about strange as it seems, unsettling and hard to understand. The world is mysterious. Life is uncertain. And, as much as we try to make sense out of everything, most of it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. I like that definition. I think that that captures exactly how I feel about about this entire scenario or history that you've discovered. Because, I think like any kid growing up in the early 90s, I watched all the shows, Sightings, and always fascinated by kind of the UFO narrative. And then as you get older, kind of understanding that this is most certainly, and people kind of had unpacked this, decades before I was aware of it, but it just opens up a new, maybe not horror, but a new level of maybe understanding or lack thereof that you're trying to get to. So I'm excited to go through some of these other histories with you. And
well, just accept that you don't know.
Yeah,
and be happy with it.
Well, thank you,
That's
Rick.
the most we can do.
I appreciate you.
All right.
And
Well,
talk. I don't know. We'll figure out next time to talk.
well, let's see if anybody besides you and I finds this interesting.
Well, I think if you send it to somebody, maybe it'll get around. But first, we got to figure out if we actually recorded anything. So we'll
Okay. If not, we can do it again.
Okay.